Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, and we are delighted to have you with us. Thanks to those of you who are in this area, and thanks especially to those who came in from elsewhere, including all of our panelists and guests who came, for the most part, from D.C. and other regions outside Charlottesville. We welcome guests to Charlottesville, except in a particular category that I don't want to mention, left over from August. Just talking with former Senator Bine, he says, God, I keep getting these emails, from Jewish parents or other people saying, is it really safe for my son or daughter to go there? They weren't from here. There were two people connected to Charlottesville, and one of them lives in D.C. So, really, it's okay. Please spread the word that Charlottesville is just as terrific as it's always been, and it's a free society, so you can't limit people coming in and out, even if you don't like them, which we intensely do not in that one category. Well, look, welcome to the 19th Annual American Democracy Conference. It's a good time to have a conference, I suppose, on democracy or politics generally. Over the last year, I think we could all agree, whatever our political perspectives, that every day has been a dog year. I don't recall a time, at least in my lifetime, maybe the late 60s, early 70s, when every day had so many developments and controversies, dare I say tweets, and all the other things. So it's an incredible time, and we'll be discussing all of this throughout the day. We know how divisive the 2016 campaign was. Last year we had this conference in Washington, and next year, because it's our 20th, we'll probably be having it in D.C. as well, and with the celebration, because some of us are getting to the age where we may not make it to the 30th or even the 25th. So we're going to make a big deal out of the 20th. But we had as our main speaker Kellyanne Conway last year, and this was after the election. We thought it was appropriate since Trump was going to be president, and we found out from our audience, especially the high school students who were there, just how divisive the Trump presidency was really likely to be. And it has lived up to its billing. I just was sent a study that I want to share with you because it relates to Thanksgiving next Thursday. This is really a well-done study out of Stanford. And it turns out, and they have elaborate statistical models, and they've worked this thing backwards and forwards. And after the 2016 election, at that Thanksgiving, on average, American families spent 20 to 30 minutes less with friends and family. That's on average, because there were so many conflicts and so many arguments. Either they wanted to avoid them and they arranged something else for Thanksgiving, or they left early, or somebody else left early. That's really, and this added up. I was stunned by this figure. 27 million fewer hours of Thanksgiving discourse with family and friends. Well, think what it's going to be this year. If it was that much last year before anything had actually happened, one can only imagine what will occur this year, which is not a good thing, or, well, depending on your family, I guess it could be. But we hope to help repair a little bit of that, tiny little bit of that today. So for 19 years, this conference has assembled top political insiders, pollsters, journalists, party representatives, and a wide range of behind-the-scenes strategists to discuss the most recent elections, but mainly, I think, to look forward to the next set of elections, because predictions about what's already happened tend to be 100% accurate. We're more interested in getting people to think ahead, to be bold, and to be wrong. And so we've tried to we blazed a trail after 2016 as far as that's concerned, along with all of our colleagues. So we are going to discuss the politics of all of this, and we invite your participation. 2017 should hypothetically be the sleepiest of the 4 years that make up the election cycle, but that clearly hasn't been the case this year. We've been tracking those races and the 2018 races for Senate and House and Governor in our Crystal Ball newsletter, and our two great people, managing editor and associate editor, Kyle Kondik and Jeff Skelly, will be heading up the first two panels, starting with Jeff. We have a new issue out this morning. I hope you're all subscribing. The Price is Right. It's free. You can't give that as your excuse. All you have to do is plug in an email. That's not too much trouble, I hope. So you should all be subscribing and tell your friends and family if they are coming to Thanksgiving. Go ahead and tell them about the crystal ball. Maybe that can bring you together. Now, this morning, it may be preposterous to all of us to suggest that a Democrat could actually win a Senate seat in Alabama. But because of what's going on there, and I'm sure the panels will discuss this, the Democrat, as of today, the election's December 12th, plenty of time for it to change, but assuming Roy Moore stays on the ballot, the Democrat is actually slightly favored now, which I really don't believe, but that's what everybody who knows politics in Alabama is telling us, and it's what those awful polls that we no longer refer to as much are also saying. So it would be amazing and incredible, and for the Republicans, stupid, if that actually happened, and it might. So we did suggest that this morning, and then we also lowered the rating a little bit in Tennessee, where former Governor Phil Bredesen may take on the Senate seat being vacated by Bob Corker, who of late is a Trump critic, and he's a strong candidate. We don't, it's a Republican state now. It'd be tough for him to win, but it's not impossible. If there's a wave like we saw in Virginia last Tuesday, that was clearly a wave. You don't have all of these, anonymous people being elected to the House of Delegates without a wave. And we haven't seen a wave like that in a long time in Virginia. We've seen it nationally in some elections, but not here. And then for the Republican constituents, we did it because it was true, but we wanted to give them something. We've lowered the Senate race in Florida to a toss-up. Senator Bill Nelson, who's a UVA law graduate, so we hated doing this to him, but we did, because it's Jeff and Kyle who are soulless. They just don't care. They're tough, they're cold, and they'll do it to anybody, and I worry about these things, but I let them take the lead because emotion shouldn't be part of this. So that's down to toss-up because Governor Rick Scott will be running. In any event, the first panel will go into all this in much more detail and talk about the battle for the Senate and other races next year. And we're so pleased that you're with us or watching via live stream, which is ongoing right now. And for those of you who like to tweet, and Democrats, Republicans, and Independents today seem to like to tweet, our hashtag is 2017 ADC, American Democracy Conference, 2017 ADC. So add that to any tweet that you send out about this conference, at least the ones that are positive. The negative tweets, you either don't send them or you misidentify them so they can never be traced. That's all I ask, okay? Now, let me call up our Associate Editor of the Crystal Ball, Jeff Skelly, to get us started and to introduce his panelists.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's awake. I'm not. I'm not really a morning person, but I'm gonna really strive to get through this, and we're gonna try to talk about the 2018 midterm election. But first, we are going to talk a little bit about Alabama because I think that's sort of a unavoidable topic at the moment. And as my panel gets seated here, I'm going to start introducing them. So first here on my left. By the way, I just want to make it clear, these are not the full introductions, because if I were to do the full introductions, we'd be here for 15 minutes. Every one of these individuals is very accomplished, and there are a lot more things that they've done that I'm going to list off here. But first, I'm going to start on the left, my immediate left, with Senator Evan Bayh, who is former two-term Democratic senator from the great state of Indiana, and also was a two-term governor prior to that. And also served as Secretary of State there, so he's won a number of elected offices. Today he is a partner at McGuire Woods, and he also serves as a senior advisor and a member of the boards of directors for a number of major firms. And importantly, we should note that he is a Wahoo, having graduated from the University School of Law in 1981, so Wahoo Wah. To his left is David Byler, who is a staff writer and chief elections analyst for the Weekly Standard. And prior to that, he was an elections analyst for Real Clear Politics. And much to his chagrin, David graduated from Princeton University. That's the last of my jokes about education for the day. To his left is Jerry Henry, who is the Senior Associate Director at APCO Worldwide a public relations and communications agency in Washington, D.C. Prior to APCO, Jerry Ann was president of Convergence Communications, where she served as an advocate and campaign manager for nonprofits. To her left is Henry Olsen, who is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he studies and provides commentary on American politics. His latest book, which just came out in June, is The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism. I have not had the pleasure of reading it yet, but I have been told by my colleague Kyle Condick that it is quite excellent, and I'm not surprised by that. Henry previously served as vice president and director of the National Research Initiative at the American Enterprise Institute. And finally, at the far end of the panel from me, is Evan Siegfried, who is a political strategist and commentator, and he serves as president of Sum Consulting, a public affairs firm. And his debut book, which came out in August of 2016, is GOP GPS, How to Find the Millennials and Urban Voters the Republican Party Needs to Survive. So having introduced my panel, I'm going to just start out with sort of a basic question, and I'm going to get their responses to it. We'll start with Senator Evan Bayh. And basically the question is, given the election results last Tuesday and what's going on in Alabama, how panicked should Republicans be based on those election results? And anyway, we'll start with Senator Bayh.
Well, thank you, particularly for your gracious introduction. It started to sound a little bit like a eulogy there for a moment, so I'm relieved, and it's great to be back in Charlottesville on the grounds and such a great university and with all of you. So I think I think they should have been concerned before the election for a number of reasons, and I think they should be even more concerned after the election. So I'd say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being kind of end of days, they're probably about an 8. If you look at history, midterm elections tend to be pretty tough on the party of the president, and under these circumstances, they may be even tougher. And Virginia might have been a harbinger of that. The president's job approval rating is anywhere from 38 to 42 or 3%, historically fairly low. Although Americans are feeling fairly good about their own personal economic situation, when you ask them about the direction of the country, by 20-some%, they think the country is heading in the wrong direction. People are still as angry as they were a year ago about the establishment, the status quo, the elites. Congress's job approval rating is still 16-18%. By the time the Obamacare replace and repeal effort got done, that was sort of a shambles. The tax bill is more popular, but it's trending in a little less popular direction. So you kind of net all this out. The thing that the Republicans have going for them, however, and it may save them at the end of the day, are the maps. Just remember, maps, maps, maps. This is going to be roughly correct. Hillary Clinton got about 2.8 million more popular votes last year than Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, I think, won 28 more congressional districts. So just think how the maps are drawn in a way that may be the ultimate firewall for the Republicans, although they're going to lose some seats over this tax bill with the change in the deductibility of state and local taxes, particularly in some of those suburban districts in New Jersey, New York, California. But the maps really do favor the Republicans. And in the Senate as well, putting Alabama aside, there are 7 Senate seats that may be competitive. 5 are in states that Donald Trump carried by at least 19%. So those are 5 Democratic incumbents running in very red states. And that may test just how tribal our politics have become. Arizona and Nevada are the 2 seats held by Republicans. I think it's probably more likely than not the Democrats will pick up both of those, but the Democrats have to run the table in order to even get to 50-50. If they picked up all 7 of those seats and Alabama, that would get them to 51-49. So it's a map. It's an uphill struggle for the Democrats. So to get back to your question, but one final thing that helps the Republicans in midterm elections, the electorate tends to be older and it tends to be whiter. And that tends to be more favorable to the Republican Party. So you net it all out, I think it's going to be, as we sit here today, about a year out, a very good election for the Democrats, whether it's the kind of wave that Larry was referring to that allows them to sweep all of the Senate races and enough to just get across the threshold in the House remains to be seen. I think today they'll get close, but not quite. If the economy were to deteriorate for any reason, then you've got a wave, and the Democrats might take both. But the maps still favor the Republicans. So an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, well, I also want to say thanks to the University of Virginia for having all of us here. And I agree with the senator that an 8 is about the right number. The way that I think about this is that 8's the right number, but it should have been an 8 before Virginia. Adding that piece of information, I don't think should change your estimation of what the midterms are going to look like. If you look at all the various indicators of what the midterms might look like. You look at presidential approval, Trump has a very low rating. You look at the generic ballot polls, which on average favor Democrats by about 10 points. You look at congressional retirements, you look at special elections and how Democrats are performing compared to their baseline in 2016 or whenever the last election they had was. You end up with all the indicators sort of pointing in the same direction. I think the senator's correct about the maps, but my view is that at some point there's enough of a vote advantage that it does overcome the maps. In 2006, if I recall correctly, Democrats won the House popular vote by 8. And the fact that they're up by 10 now, and that historically, I mean, this isn't a law of physics, but historically the generic ballot polls tend to move against the party in power, so they tend to move towards the Democrats. It's all kind of adding up in the same direction. So I would say 8 is roughly the right estimate here.
Well, thank you guys for having me here, and I'm going to have to be the curmudgeon and be different. I'll say 7.9, just so it's not, so I don't say 8 again. And I think it's everything that has been highlighted here, but I would agree that it's before the election that concern that Republicans should face was there, and it's not just because of the maps, and it's not just because of the electorate numbers that we saw. I think what we're also seeing is a lot of confusion within the campaigns and with strategists trying to figure out who it is that they need to be talking to and how they need to be talking to them. And I think that the Virginia election showcased a lot of that. You saw different appeals being made to different groups, and the analysis since then, which quickly got overshadowed by Alabama, we were all discussing that, but the analysis after that also showed that confusion. If you look back historically, there were measures that Republicans needed to take that they had documented in 2012 after Romney lost the election in the what we like to call the autopsy. And then we had this last election came along, and everybody was trying to look at who is this new base that we need to reach out to. And I think that one of the underestimations that they made, that has been made since then, is how much of a drag Hillary was on Democratic votes. That drag propelled somebody like Trump forward, maybe more than Trump himself propelled himself forward. She pulled a lot of votes. If you go back and look at the numbers, Mitt Romney won more votes in Michigan than Donald Trump did, but he still lost the state. And you can see some of those numbers play out. So in Virginia, without Hillary on the ticket and in a few other districts, you suddenly saw Democrats coming out and voting the same way they would have if we'd continued projecting and predicting from 2012 votes and earlier. So I think that Republicans need to be very stressed about not just the numbers and the maps, but really looking at what sort of strategy they want to use, what has worked and what hasn't, and not let themselves be caught up in some of the chaos that Twitter and armchair quarterbacks can make.
Yeah, I'll put myself out on a limb here. I'll say 8.1. But I want to put some numbers behind this. I run a group called the Voter Study Group, which puts together 20 people from far left to far right, and we agree on a uniform set of questions, and we field massive polls that ask between 5,000 and 8,000 people. And there are also longitudinal polls. So these are the same people who took similar questionnaires back in 2011. So we're the only group in the country that has the data that allows us to identify who actually were Clinton, Obama voters, who actually were Obama, Trump voters, and so forth. And what our July survey showed when we asked a generic ballot question was the following. If you were an Obama Clinton voter, you're almost certainly going to vote for a Democrat. If you were a Republican Trump voter, you're almost certainly going to vote for a Republican. Nothing in the 2017 elections suggested that that has changed. The groups that'll decide whether it's a wave or not are the groups in the middle. The people who voted for Romney and then voted for Clinton, our poll showed were overwhelmingly likely to vote for a Democrat. Now, that was not true in the 2016 congressional elections, that person after person won re-election in districts that were carried by Hillary Clinton because the Romney Clinton voter voted for the Republican. In 2017, 14 of the 15 seats that the Democrats picked up in the state house were in Clinton-carried House districts. They did not only pick up one seat that Trump carried, and that was a 47-46 seat that Trump carried. What that showed is what we've been seeing in races throughout the country in this year, which is that the person who was a traditional Republican, the person who voted for W. Bush in 04 and McCain in 08 and Romney in 12, but Clinton in 16, is now a Democrat. That person voted Democratic up and down the ticket in Virginia. They did the same in judicial races and local races in Chester County, which is another highly educated area that flipped. This is a warning sign and a terrible sign for Republicans, particularly in the House and in the gubernatorial races. But the flip side is the Obama-Trump voter. The Obama-Trump voter remains less motivated to vote, and you saw that in 2017, is that their share of the vote in Virginia was slightly down a little bit, but they remain committed to voting for the Republicans if they do vote. And so what that tells me is that the House is in real trouble because the Democrats need 24 seats to win the House. 23 seats were carried by Hillary Clinton. What it tells me is that Republicans running for governor are in real trouble because they hold 12 seats that were either 12 states that were either Obama twice and Clinton or Obama twice and Trump. And the fall off among the Romney-Clinton voters suggests that a lot of those seats are in trouble. But what it suggests to me is that the Senate may be the Republican firewall, precisely for the reason that Senator Bayh outlined. And by looking at these groups over the next year, you'll be able to really accurately predict who falls and who doesn't. And I think the Republicans are in really bad shape, but not death-like shape, particularly in the Senate.
Well, I've always seen that in chaos you should find opportunity, which is why, after speaking to every friend of mine who's an operative in the Republican Party, I bought shares in every medical company I could that produces prescription drugs for anxiety. Since then, Republicans have been getting more and more Valium to deal with what I think is going to be a 9 on the panic level for 2018. When I started looking at what are we going to do as a Republican Party, especially keep the House, we really don't have much. We have just a lot of people very worried about what's going on. We have no real message at this point. We have a party that's in the middle of a civil war about the direction of it. There's sort of the Breitbart Bannon wing of the party that is all consuming, and that, I would say, has overtaken the Trump wing, because we saw in the Alabama Senate primary, Trump endorsed Luther Strange, but he had no ability to get Luther Strange over the finish line, and it was Roy Moore. That mindset and mentality is the primary thing, not so much Donald Trump. At the same time, there's a loosely cobbled together coalition of Republicans, such as myself and the neoconservatives, the more social conservatives, who are trying to say, well, this is the direction we want the party to go in. So you're going to have each candidate in each House race trying to push their own narrative. At the same time, Democrats, while we do like to say as Republicans, the snarky Dems in disarray comment, yes, the Democratic National Committee is in disarray, but then look at the DCCC, the DSCC, and how much money they're raising. Then go look at the candidates themselves. At no point in history have we seen an opposition party like the Democrats with so many candidates having raised already, I think it was in the first half of 2017, they had already raised, or there had been over 50 candidates who had raised more than $5,000. That's unheard of. And I start getting worried. And then I started looking at what happened last Tuesday, and I saw it wasn't so much the party apparatus that helped bring these Democratic candidates, not only in Virginia and New Jersey across the finish line, but in places like New York. We had some regional races. It was the groundwork and the grassroots apparatus. They're self-organizing. They are fired up and ready to go, to borrow a line from some guy who got elected president before Donald Trump. But there were two races in particular that really worried me. The first was the Westchester County Executives race. A man named Rob Astorino, who was first elected in 2009 and re-elected in 2013, he ran for governor against Andrew Cuomo and outperformed what he should have in upstate New York and gave Andrew Cuomo a much closer race in 2014. He was up for re-election as Westchester County Executive, and with a week to go, Robert Mercer poured $1 million into his campaign, which is unheard of for that race, and he lost by 10 points. And he was going to run for governor next year. And then there was the Hempstead Town Supervisor in Nassau County in Long Island. And since the office was created in 1917, it has always been held by a Republican. Anthony Santino, the town supervisor, got thrown out for a Democrat. Never happened before. So when I start seeing that, yeah, I'm buying Pfizer.
Well, I think this is a good chance to transition into talking about the Senate first, and then we'll talk about the House. And, you know, the thing that's on everyone's mind at the moment on the Senate side is clearly what's happening in Alabama. Events are still moving. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but as Larry mentioned earlier, we just shifted our rating there to leans Democratic, which are words I can't believe I'm actually saying. And so I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts about what's happening there. Do you think Moore can pull it out? Do you think, I mean, it looks like Alabama Republicans are probably going to stick by Moore. And I just sort of want, you know, any thoughts you guys might have on the chaos in Alabama. And we can start with Senator Bayh.
Well, chaos is the right word, and it's difficult to predict because every day brings new revelations, accusations, however you want to characterize them. So I get back to what I said at the beginning. This is going to test just how tribal our politics has become. Our president famously said during the last election he could go out and shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his base would still stay with him. Is that going to be the case for Roy Moore in Alabama as well? He was a historically weak candidate to begin with and has underperformed in Alabama. But these races, and people sometimes analogize to a race in Louisiana with David Vitter, who was a sitting senator, ran for governor. It turned out that he had been involved with some prostitutes, and so that was very damaging to him. And he went on to lose the governor's race in Alabama, in Louisiana, by 10 points. But there's a difference between governor's races and Senate races and races for the House of Representatives that have become increasingly parliamentary. There's a liberal party and a conservative party, and people tend to stick with their parties. I think the point about all the money that's being raised is a good one. But after the blizzard of ads, people end up saying, I don't like any of them, I don't know who to believe, and so I'm just going to stick with my tribe. And so I would take with a grain of salt. The last thing I'd say is, just as the polls were all wrong about the Trump-Clinton race for a variety of reasons, I would take with a little grain of salt these polls out of Alabama. There are probably some voters there who are reluctant to say to a pollster that they're supporting Roy Moore. But they may end up voting Roy Moore because they just can't bring themselves to vote for a Democrat who's pro women's right to choose and is in favor of some gun restrictions and is going to vote against the kind of Supreme Court and other judicial nominees that the Republican Party would be for. So my guess is it's 50-50. This is just a guess. Could change tomorrow. 50-50 with still a slight edge for the Republican just because of how tribal our politics has become. And the last thing I'd mention is that I think a majority of Alabama voters, more than 50%, and this is a state Trump carried by 25, a majority of Alabama voters are white evangelicals. And so they will be particularly difficult. You wouldn't think intuitively, given the nature of some of the allegations, this might be the case, but they tend to kind of vote down the line pretty much too. So they'll be hard to peel away from a Republican, even if he is Roy Moore.
Yeah, so I still think of this race as a toss-up. There's a couple reasons for that. One is the polling. Right now, the Real Clear Politics average has Roy Moore up by 3 points, at least as of when I was checking it in the green room over there. And there's some uncertainty around that estimate. A lot of people who know about polls know that there's random error and that you only sample some small part of the population, so you get some sampling error and things like that. But there's also error in what choices pollsters choose to make. These survey researchers are all trying to figure out what the electorate's going to look like, how many Trump supporters are going to show up, what the demographics are going to look like, things along those lines. And really reasonable choices in different directions about that can lead to different estimates. So the fact that the average is close, I think, puts it in sort of toss-up territory. Like Jeff was saying, this is kind of an amazing race. I was thinking through it and reading what was published on Sabato's Crystal Ball this morning about the race going from toss-up to leans Democratic, and I was thinking, maybe I still have it as a toss-up, but wow, we're talking about toss-up versus leans Democratic in Alabama. If I'm remembering correctly, Donald Trump got 62.1% of the vote in this state. This is not a state that typically elects Democrats. It's been decades since it elected a Democrat to the Senate. Yeah, so the other thing to keep in mind in terms of assessing this race is thinking about Roy Moore in this context. If you look at his 2012 run when he was down ballot for the Supreme Court seat and you compare his showing to Mitt Romney's, there was a big drop-off. Alabamians started off sort of with a much lower opinion of Roy Moore than they would have for a generic Republican. And so, yeah, this has room to get worse for him.
Yeah, I agree with a bit of what's been said here. I think the tribalism, as you called it, and I would say just the chaos of the race is going to have more of an impact than people may think. Right now, everybody is so inundated, not just in this race, but it happened here in Virginia with the attacks on all sides, that it is very easy to just shut down and ignore so much of that. And I think it's important to remember that this election is not happening next Tuesday. We still have some time to go. Roy Moore already had made himself into a firebrand who was going to be attacked, and it already had become an us versus them long before any of these allegations came out. During the primary, when it was him versus Luther Strange, they both battled it out hard, and people have already decided to let those things pass. His supporters already have made that decision. Continuing to make that decision from now till Election Day is not going to be a huge step for them. So the chaos of the day, the Twitter polls, if you will, may make that something that looks like it leans more towards him, but I still see this as Alabama, and I think for opponents of Roy Moore, there's a need to be cautious that they don't actually drive more support towards him by people buckling down and digging their heels in and saying, no, this is our guy, and this is just another case of Washington, D.C. and Mitch McConnell trying to take out our guy. Because everything right now, the accusations have been called a lie. The reasons that they might be lies have now been called lies, and the lies about the lies have been so nobody knows what to believe. I could go on.
To me, I was on the plane last night and I was looking at my Twitter feed, which is increasingly a source of humor and dismay simultaneously. And I saw Roy Moore's latest tweet was, "Senator McConnell, bring it on." To which Twitter immediately exploded by noting that that was the title of a movie about high school cheerleaders. I would agree with everything that Senator Bai said. I would just ask you to look at two things as you're evaluating the polls, because as David said, one of the things that you need to do is not just look at what we call the top lines, but you need to look at what we call the crosstabs. You need to look at who's being surveyed and what the subgroups are saying. Alabama is incredibly racially polarized. Every 1% of an underestimate of the African American population basically shifts the margin towards Roy Moore by 1%. How many African Americans will turn out? In 2012, they had President Obama to turn them out, and Roy Moore still won 51 to 48. Every small decline in African American turnout increases the chance of him winning. Secondly, we know that from that past race where Moore won only, I think it was 51-48, David?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So we already know that, based on past results, that about 20% of people who voted for Donald Trump dislike Roy Moore so much, even if they're Republican, that they would either vote for a Democrat or sit out of the race. The question is, does this move the extra 5%? Do you go from about 20% of normally Republican voters who are going to switch to Moore to around the 25 to 30%? That'll come almost exclusively among whites. It'll come almost exclusively in higher educated areas. And a poll that catches those sort of movements, I'll take as being more serious than a poll that doesn't catch those movements but has a more eye-catching top line.
I think that the really interesting thing that came out was there was a JMC analytics poll that came out on Saturday or Sunday that said the accusations against Roy Moore made 28% of the electorate more likely to vote for him. And I think that's because we have been having this scapegoat mentality in the Republican Party, the fake news, the us versus them mentality. And I think it goes to that tribalism that was described by Jerry and others, where we are telling our base as a party, if you hear some news that you don't like, it's not real. It doesn't matter what facts are. It's more an opinion-based feeling. And at the same time, we are seeing where the Republican brand is heavily damaged across the country, and it coincides with Donald Trump because he is the prism in which we are viewed as a party. I saw in that same poll that millennials, who are the group that detest Donald Trump most consistently to the point that his disapproval ratings nationally are 67% to upwards of 74% in every poll, Donald Trump's approval rating among millennials in the JMC poll was 63%. So it was a complete flip from the rest of the millennial generation. I think that actually works toward Roy Moore's advantage. And the other thing that works toward Roy Moore's advantage is that voters are still angry at Washington. They've been angry in 2010 at Democrats in power. They were angry in 2012, 2014, 2016 especially. And their way of sending a message to Washington was by electing Donald Trump, and now it's going to be by voting for Roy Moore. What he was accused of was despicable, but a lot of people feel that sending that message is more important than the morals. They feel that Roy Moore and Donald Trump are their way of sticking their thumb in the eyes of the people that they feel have come every election cycle, overpromised, and never delivered on every promise that they've come out with. So they are willing to sacrifice moral beliefs in an ability to get some sort of vengeance. And that worries me when you see voters who act like that. And I don't know at this point how you overcome that unless you turn out some new group to compensate for it.
I was just going to make one last comment. So I'm going to quote Groucho Marx here, who once said, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" And the reason I mention that is, with your own eyes, you've seen the reaction of Mitch McConnell, who is one of the most astute politicians. I served with him for 12 years, and whatever else you may think of the senator, he's pretty astute when it comes to politics. So when you see him come out so vigorously and oppose Roy Moore, looking for a write-in candidate, and Moore's not going to drop out. The reason I'm mentioning all this is Mitch cares about, more than anything else, having the majority. Yes, Roy Moore would be a complete loose cannon and a total pain to deal with if he wins, but McConnell would, in my estimation, put up with that to keep the majority. What that tells you when he comes out so vigorously against Roy Moore is that the crystal ball may be right and what I told you may be wrong, because it tells you that the data that Mitch McConnell is seeing shows that Moore may be a loser.
Jerry?
I was just going to add, this is a more anecdotal point, but I think we've all touched on it, and it's worth noting. In addition to the work mentioned in my bio, I am the chair of the Young Republicans in Alexandria, and I spent a lot of time knocking on doors and talking to voters. And it is worth noting, and can't be forgotten, that the general opinion in Virginia, and I just came from Texas working with some voters there, and I have family in Alabama, the general opinion of every politician is that they've probably all done everything that Roy Moore is accused of already. So revealing that doesn't change anybody's minds. We could go in and talk about things that we thought that Northam had done or anything, and it didn't matter. The opinion is so low. If you have a title near your name and you've been in Washington, D.C., you're already as bad as any accusation that could be brought. So that may also have less clout than people expect. And I think that's worth noting when you look at this.
It also should be noted that in the Breitbart universe, privately with friends of mine who are in that, and talked to Steve Bannon, they've said to me that they know Roy Moore is flawed, and this was before the accusations. They said, he's a little bit of a schmuck, putting it lightly. But this is their way of sending a message to Mitch McConnell, the all-consuming obsession with the Breitbart orbit of getting Mitch McConnell is really hindering the growth of the party. But I think that is what you're going to have a lot of voters driving out there and saying, I want to tell Mitch McConnell, you're fired.
Yeah, so let's turn to 2018 proper. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in Alabama. And I will mention that the last Democrat to win a Senate seat in Alabama was Richard Shelby. He won re-election in 1992, but then he switched parties to become Republican in 1994. So it's been a while. So if Doug Jones wins, it'll be pretty monumental. So looking ahead to 2018 proper, I think it's worth noting that, Democrats are defending a ton of seats, 25 of the 33 that are scheduled to be up. And in the 26 midterm cycles from 1914 to 2014, 91% of incumbents from the party that's not in the White House have won re-election. So Democrats are defending a lot of seats, but there is a lot of evidence that the party that's not in the White House tends to do all right, even when they are defending a lot of seats. And so I was, based on that percentage, that would roughly mean 2 or 3 Democratic incumbents would lose. Now, of course, it could be more, it could be less, who knows? We'll just have to see. But I just wanted the panel's opinion on just who is the most vulnerable Democrat running for re-election, and what are really the opportunities for Republicans?
So the 3 I would keep your eye on, there are 5 of them, as I mentioned, 5 incumbent Democrats running from states that Trump carried by at least 19%. Indiana was 19, Missouri was 19, West Virginia, I think, was 40. North Dakota and Montana were both close to 30. So if our politics has become really tribal, particularly with regard to federal races, this is uphill running for those 5 incumbents. But I think in Montana and North Dakota, I think John Tester and Heidi Heitkamp will probably be okay, because the populations of these states are so small that you can know, most of your voters personally know you. And so that may enable them to kind of break through some of this just by dint of personal familiarity and the fact that it may be a good Democratic year and all that. So I would focus on the others. West Virginia, Joe Manchin, if you were going to have a Democrat win in West Virginia, it would be Joe Manchin, popular former governor, pro-coal, a number of other things. But 40% for Trump, that's uphill running. And then Missouri, Claire last time, with the help of the DSCC, was enabled to play in the Republican primary and got the opponent she wanted. Who knows who her opponent will be this time? Keep an eye on that. And then my home state of Indiana, where Joe Donnelly, I think Indiana's probably 50-50. Joe Donnelly benefited from real divisions in the Republican Party last time, and a candidate who said that if a woman was impregnated by a rapist, it was God's will. So that was the end of any suburban women voting for him. Will that replicate itself? But on the other hand, in our primary, we have a Republican primary. 2 Republican congressmen are running against each other. If it happens to be one of those Republican congressmen wins the primary, apropos of what was said earlier, if you're a Democrat running in one of those states, you want a sitting member of Congress as your opponent, someone who's already in the swamp, who's not running to, as a change agent, et cetera, et cetera. There's a 3rd candidate in Indiana, a small businessman who's willing to put $6, $7, $8 million of his own money into the race. If he happens to win, much more dangerous. So directly answer your question, I'd look at West Virginia, Indiana, and Missouri. But again, remember this, for the Democrats to get a majority in the Senate, they have to hold all 5 of those states, all of them. They also have to win Arizona and Nevada, which I think we probably will. And then, in addition to all that, we have to pick up some other state, probably Alabama. If not Alabama, I ask you, how likely is it that a Democrat will win Tennessee or Texas? So basically, to get to 51, the Democrats have to run the table.
Yeah, so I kind of think about this in 2 ways. The first is to put the races into tiers based on how well known the various candidates are. And some of the recent polling helps with this. A polling firm called Morning Consult recently did a poll that gauged the approval rating of various senators, or all the senators, in their home states. And what they found was that in Missouri and Indiana, Claire McCaskill and Joe Donnelly, respectively, still had a lot of voters who didn't know who they were, and their favorability ratings were under 50%. I would say that that's a little bit of a dangerous place, because that potentially allows your opponent to define you, to, like Senator Bai said, maybe say that you're part of, this Washington presence that a lot of voters in these states really don't like and have rebelled against. What you notice when you move into the other states is that in North Dakota, Montana, and West Virginia, you still have senators who are better known and whose approval ratings are above 50%. Now, important caveat here, we're measuring these ratings before the campaign really gets underway, before ads go up that say things like, Senator Joe Manchin cast the deciding vote to save the Affordable Care Act, things like that. So that's a little bit how I'd put the initial assessment of candidates is that some of them have sort of a better, more established personal brand than others. So Democrats, I would think, would be more worried about Indiana and Missouri. But in these Senate elections, and this is kind of the second way I think about it, a lot depends on the national environment and national partisanship. You can see this when you look at historical data, when you see what predicts what in terms of what's helpful for projecting Senate results. The state level partisanship and what voters think of the president in that state really matters. So I built a simulator when I was working at Real Clear Politics that took in various scenarios for President Trump's approval rating and essentially spat out rough win probabilities for various senators. And if you have Trump in the sort of high 30s range, a lot of these Democrats are still able to keep their seats. Joe Manchin has an especially tough fight given the lean of his state, but you start to see senators like Tester and Heitkamp and these others still being able to win the majority of times. So, I mean, I think what everyone else has said about the map is true. It's definitely an uphill battle, and Democrats sort of have to do everything right to get to 50-50 or to take the chamber. But yeah, that's about where I'd put it.
Well, I was thinking about this, and there's only so many seats to look at, so it can be fairly simple to just look at which ones are most likely to be defeated. I do agree. I think Claire McCaskill is the one that I honed in on. She actually had a pretty tough race before. I think that's Missouri's always been a little bit rough. In the last few years, it's been rough. Blunt even had a very rough time in this last cycle. But there's another factor here that doesn't necessarily impact exactly which ones we're looking at right now. It's almost like we're in some sort of warped time zone where just the time from now to 2018 may be a much larger, a much longer timeline than we, right, at the pace that things change, and we need to bear that in mind. A concern that I have and that I think needs to be weighed into this is the number of members in the Senate and the House opting to not run for re-election. And I think there may be states, and this is, there may be a few places, I'd be hard pressed, I don't see Cornyn or that many people dropping out, but you've got some other places, there are places where there could be some new states that open up that could provide additional opportunities that haven't been looked at before, and that would throw things into chaos because you no longer have any incumbents. And you'd have to make a whole new simulator.
Well, we counted for incumbency, so.
I would take a look at a couple of things. One, Missouri and Indiana, these are accidental senators. Yeah. That in both cases they were elected because of massive misstatements by the Republican nominee about abortion that convinced not millions, but a large percentage of women who were less conservative Republicans to switch over. Assuming that that doesn't happen again, the fact that these are highly Republican states that have proven to be very partisan. In fact, in Missouri last time, we had a very attractive Democratic candidate, Jason Kander, who ran as a non-liberal Democrat. He still lost by 3 percentage points to somebody who I think can charitably be described as a walking representative of the Republican establishment, Roy Blunt. So I would start by thinking that the Democrats are 2 seats down. And then you go back to the partisanship, which is, that everything that we're seeing is that if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, you are still highly likely to want to vote for Republicans. Now, I'm not saying that somebody like a Tester or a Heitkamp or Manchin can't overcome that, but they have a huge uphill battle to do that. Sherrod Brown is running, and we haven't mentioned him yet. Trump won Ohio by 8 percentage points, and Ohio was notable for being one of the very few states in the country where there was not a noticeable suburban movement among highly educated voters. That most of every other major metropolitan area, you saw highly educated voters moving towards Hillary Clinton. You didn't see that in Cincinnati or Cleveland. You did see it in Columbus, which again suggests that he might be somebody who's not on people's radar screens, but if Trump voters show up and vote, Sherrod Brown would basically have to get about 10% of Trump voters to switch over to survive in a narrow chance. So I do think Nevada is gone for the Republicans. It's now pretty much a Democratic state. Dean Heller's got a divided party. I think if Jerry Tarkanian were to beat him, he'd lose by even more. I think that's a net pickup. And Arizona is a toss-up, depending on the Republican nominee. But I think it's going to be very hard for the Democrats simply to hold even, given the tribalism that we have going. The last time we had this conflict between strong incumbents and a national trend was the 2014 elections, when Democratic strategists were telling us Republicans have only knocked off 3 or 4 Senate incumbents in the last 20 years. Landrew's going to hold on. Pryor's going to hold on. And the fact is the national trend trumped strong Democrats, even as they ran ahead of the national ticket on the presidential level. And I suspect that's likelier to be true this time than people are willing to let on.
The race that nobody's talked about that I think could be a little bit of a sleeper is Bill Nelson in Florida. He lucked out his past 2 re-elections in 2006 and 2012 with having really subpar Republican candidates. Katherine Harris ran against him in 2006, and he crushed her. And in 2012, he crushed Connie Mack. But if Rick Scott were to get in the race, you have a real ball game with a guy who's been in Washington as a senator for the past 18 years. He does have and has in the past had appeal to more moderate Republicans, but Rick Scott is fairly popular in Florida as well, so that might peel them off, and Bill Nelson could be in very serious trouble. I think one factor we haven't really recognized is that we saw Joe Manchin and Claire McCaskill, Heidi Heitkamp, and others early on in the Trump presidency going to the White House and sitting down with the president and talking about issues to the extent they could. And the reaction from the further left regions of the Democratic Party were screaming bloody murder. It was, we have to primary them. Joe Manchin's really a Republican. He's betraying the progressive cause. And they're still talking about it, about primarying these senators. And that would be the worst thing to happen to them, because they're going to be beaten up and bloodied coming out of any sort of primary. We're seeing Dianne Feinstein, who I'm going to go out on a limb and say she's likely to get reelected, but she's being primaried from the left because she didn't, in the words of the far left, resist enough. And that sort of mentality is exactly why Jerry and I have always joked about how Democrats are very good at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So if you look at what Democrats are doing for those races, and if they get involved and want to go further to the left and pull them to the left, you could see Republicans smiling and taking less Valium.
Well, I'd love to keep talking about the Senate, but we only have so much time. So let's turn to the lower chamber of Congress, the U.S. House. Currently, the Republicans have a 240 to 194 advantage. There's a vacancy in Pennsylvania. It's a Republican-leaning seat. There's going to be a special election next year for it. Assuming Republicans hold on to that, they'll still have the 241-194 advantage that they had coming out of the 2016 election. And that would mean the Democrats would have to win 24 net seats to take over the House. And currently, at least in 2 polling averages, Real Clear Politics, 538, Democrats are ahead by at least 10 points on the generic ballot question, which is when pollsters ask voters or respondents, are you planning to vote for the Democrat or the Republican in your district, or would you prefer to see Democrats or Republicans in control of the House? There are a couple different ways of asking it, I guess. And so, that's a warning sign to Republicans. And so I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on how Republicans can change that political environment, or is it up to Trump to change that political environment? And are things bad enough they could lose the House? And their general thoughts on the House at this point. Let me start with Senator Bai.
Well, it's going to be a tough night for Republicans already, as we discussed in response to the first question. So I think right off the bat, out of the 24, they're losing, 13, 14, 15. There's not a lot that can be done. I don't see how the president's going to dramatically improve his favorability rating. I don't see how they're going to deal with suppressed Democratic enthusiasm, unless, as the other Evan mentioned, that we have multiple primaries breaking out, pulling our candidates to the left. So with regard to so my advice, what can they do about it? Don't threaten to shut down the government. That would be number one. Don't threaten to default on the national debt. That would be number two. Stop trying to repeal and replace Obamacare, because your efforts in that regard were, by the time the argument played itself out, only about 30% popular. And on this tax bill, it's going to cut both ways. The thing that will help the Republicans is there are some provisions in the tax bill to accelerate capital investment by businesses, allowing them to write off 100% of their investments in new plant, equipment, and expansion over the next 5 years. That may serve as a temporary boost and get us through the midterm. This economic cycle is getting pretty long. The markets are fully valued. You'd think at some point in here we'd have economic softness. If this bill adds enough stimulus to get them through the midterm, that will help. But conversely, and particularly for the House, and I mentioned this before, doing away with the deductibility of state and local taxes is going to hammer some of these suburban Republicans in New Jersey and New York and California, around Chicago, possibly the one representative here in Virginia. Correct. So, I mean, they are literally lining up a number of their, even if they don't vote for it, they're going to be held responsible for it, and that may cost them a number of seats right there. So if I had to say today, I'd say short of 24, unless it's a complete wave, but so close that it makes the House just ungovernable. Poor Paul Ryan, because of the Freedom Caucus. I mean, it'll be a margin of 2, 4, 6 votes, something like that, which makes it just ungovernable. That would be my my ultimate prediction on the House. Good night for Democrats, but given the maps, maybe not quite enough to get over the hump.
Yeah, so I would probably give Democrats at this point, given what we know now, a 75-ish% ballpark chance of retaking the House. And the way that I process this is through sort of 3 indicators. First, generic ballot, second, retirements, and third, win rate. So in terms of the generic ballot, in 2006, like I said earlier, Democrats won the House popular vote by 8 points. They're currently leading by 10 plus points. There have been changes in the map that have helped Republicans, changes in, voter coalitions as well. We can get into that more if we want to. But the map is tilted towards Republicans at this point. That being said, Democrats currently have an increased lead over where they were in 2006 when they managed to take the House. I would guess that somewhere in the double digits would probably do the trick for them. Polls can move, but that's a little bit of where I'm at with the polls. In terms of retirement, this is actually one of the undercovered sort of stories of the battle for control of the House. If you look at the rate of Republican retirements from the House, it's outstripping some of these other midterms where Republicans have been or have fared poorly in the past. And incumbency does confer a real advantage. If you look at historical data, incumbents oftentimes do a few points better than non-incumbents. So when these politicians retire, sometimes that advantage is lost. And then that threshold of generic ballot that you need to retake the House sort of goes down a little bit if the opposing party to you is retiring. The third thing that I think about in terms of this is win rates. So there's a couple different ways to attack who's going to win the House and why. One thing that I did was I divided all of the 2016 districts up based on their partisan lean, which is how they voted on the presidential level compared to what the national environment was that year. I divided that for 2016, divided up for 2006, and basically asked how often in 2006 did Democrats win districts that leaned 2 to 4 points to the right, 4 to 6 points to the right, 2 to 4 points to the left, so on and so forth. Applied all those numbers through and removed any blue dog Democrats that were there in really Republican districts. And if you do all that math, essentially what you come out to is Democrats winning a narrow majority if they perform in line with 2006. In terms of what President Trump could do, my best sort of 2 things that I would guess would be to advocate for policies that poll better. The current healthcare or the healthcare replacement bills that have been proposed and haven't passed have not polled very well and have taken a toll on his approval rating. And so if he can find a way to increase his approval rating, his approval rating increased slightly when he was seen as competently handling the hurricanes Harvey and Irma. So if you can sort of improve that rating, then potentially Republicans would do better. And also do anything he can to keep incumbents in vulnerable districts from retiring. That would be sort of my things that President Trump might be able to do.
Yeah, I agree with most of what's been said here. I think the retirements play a huge factor here, and if you look at not only the rate of retirement, but also the type of candidates retiring, a lot of them are people who came from less partisan districts, or more middle districts. They're the people who are going to face the toughest battle, and those are some of the ones who are choosing not to go through that, those are going to be harder districts for a new Republican to go in and win. I also think it's really important to look at, we talked earlier about Virginia and what we can learn from that for 2018. If we go back and we look at Karen Handel's race in Georgia, which none of us have talked about, those were huge races with tons and tons of money poured into them. And this special election in Alabama for a different chamber, but is also a very expensive race. But these are also occurring sort of on their own. And in 2018, you're going to have a much broader field of play. The money may be split up differently, and people may be less focused nationally on some of these individual races. So I think if I had advice, one of the biggest things I would say is that more candidates need to go home now, spend more time. I mean, I know shouldn't be news to anybody in this room, but it is getting home and getting in their district and making sure that they have their own tribes built and that people support them regardless of what that national narrative is, to fend off some of those big fights.
I give the Democrats about a 2/3 chance of retaking the House, but I come at it a little bit differently than David does. I take a look at 3 types of House districts. One is the districts that Clinton carried, that Republicans hold. The second are districts that Trump won, but with less than 50%, of which there's about 15 or 20. And then the third is the districts that voted for Obama, but then voted for Trump. If you take a look at the voter study group data that I suggested that have been borne out by the subsequent election returns, any Republican who is running in a district that Clinton carried should be extremely worried that these are exactly the sorts of districts and sorts of areas like Hempstead or like Westchester or like Northern Virginia that voted up and down the ballot for Democrats in 2017. I would venture that, notwithstanding retirements, 80 to 90% of those people are going to be gone, and that gets the Democrats almost to within. Then the question is, how many Republicans can they switch in the other seats? And then the question is, do traditional Democrats who voted for Obama twice and voted for Gore and voted for Kerry, the sort of person who came over and voted for Trump in eastern Ohio, in eastern Iowa, and northern Maine, do enough of them get discouraged or go back home to their party to lose? That's the second group of districts. There's about 13 Republicans who hold those seats, and I think a number of those will fall as well. Then you've got the third group, where the group we haven't talked about are the Republicans who in the presidential race voted for a third-party candidate. The slight indication we have is that they're beginning to split their ballot more down ballot as well. And the one seat that was picked up by the Democrats that Clinton didn't carry in Northern Virginia was exactly that sort of seat, that Trump carried it, but under 50%, and the Democrat prevailed narrowly. I would look very carefully at seats like Eric Paulson's seat in suburban Minnesota. Trump carried less than 50, not Eric Paulson, Jason Lewis. Trump carried, but less than 50%. The Omaha seat. These are the places where a bad trend for Republicans will show up in these light red districts. And I think barring a massive change in sentiment, and the tax bill is not going to accomplish it because it hurts too many people in the short term directly on their taxes, I think that what you're going to see is probably a narrow 5 to 10 seat Democratic majority in the House at the end of the time. What can Trump do? Well, think about the North Korean missile crisis in mid-October. There's nothing like a successful handling of a foreign crisis that rallies the nation in the short term.
I don't know if saying Little Rocket Man is going to rocket Republicans up in the polls, but Henry is right. I looked at the Cook Political Report grading of all of the races, and 82 were considered competitive. 46 of them are truly competitive in that just slightly lean Republican or slightly lean Democrat or toss-up. And that's a lot of races. So when you have that, and in combination with the thing that took a lot of people by surprise in Virginia, particularly in New York last week, that we saw all of these races that nobody had on their radars. I think there might be 3 or 4 races that just pop out of nowhere that will flip without people seeing it beforehand, and then it'll make sense in hindsight. I think that one of the big factors for us as a Republican Party right now is whether or not we can govern. And we have not been able to do that. Right now, the only thing we have to hang our hats on in terms of results is the new Supreme Court Justice, Justice Gorsuch. And that's only senators who can go back and do that. The House can't say it. The House can say, yes, we passed, the repeal and replacement of Obamacare, but that never became law. And they're probably going to pass tax reform today. But will that become law? And unless we can really effectively demonstrate to voters that we have the ability to govern, there are going to be a lot of Republicans who stay home because they say, we trusted you, you had both chambers and the White House, and you could do nothing. I think that Donald Trump is actually providing cover because of his outsized personality for the fact that we have a governing problem that existed long before Trump was president. We have too many factions in the party. The Freedom Caucus, as Senator Bayh mentioned, they are unwilling to compromise on any aspects. It drove John Boehner into retirement, where he's now sort of laughing at everybody else having to deal with the problems of today because they're only getting worse. So when it comes to House races, when you have that energized Democratic base that's organizing on its own and really getting out there and finding ways to raise money and go around the DNC, which is in shambles, and Republicans getting more and more depressed, you're going to see that. I think that there are plenty of Republicans who are actually exciting Republicans who offer a vision for the future, and Will Hurd in particular, but he's going to probably have a tough race. I think he will actually survive because he's managed to walk a very fine line and tightrope of how to deal with Trump and deal with other issues and be there like he cares and actually get back into the district and be involved in it. But I don't think there are many other Republicans who have been so successful.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Just 2 quick points. So if my colleagues on the panel are correct and the Democrats do get a narrow majority in the House, the Senate will be so closely divided. There will basically be no room unless the president really does go full bipartisan on infrastructure or something like that. There will be no prospects for significant legislative action. And so in the House, you can look forward to 2 years of investigations all the time. I mean, it's going to be Benghazi on steroids, only in reverse. And so all the Republican cabinet members and their staffs will need to lawyer up. And so that's number one. These investigations will be going on all the time on the House side. And the other thing is, I think it makes it more likely that Robert Mueller's investigation will go to its conclusion, because the House might view the president's removal of him as being an impeachable offense.
Oh, I was just going to make a joke about the smart Aggies, like Will Hurd.
I was going to make a joke that I can't wait to see what Louise Linton wears to testifying before Congress.
If anyone didn't see it, the wife of the Treasury Secretary, who has created a stir, was captured in a picture holding a bunch of dollar bills up, freshly printed, I believe. And anyway, it created a Twitter sensation, if you didn't see it. So I think now we're going to move to Q&A. So I'm not sure where the mics are, but I think they are probably back there. And we'll get about 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll get set for the second panel. We have a question up here in the front. You can get a microphone to him.
So one of the major assumptions in midterm elections is that the opposition party does very well. Some have said that President Trump and Republicans might not really be acting like they are the governing majority party right now. So is Trump still, in a way, the opposition party? Could they run like that? Would that work, or would that just be self-sabotaging?
Anyone have a response to that?
I mean, what I would say about this is that empirically, a lot of presidencies over the last few decades have taken a lot of different strategies, and the same thing tends to happen in midterms, with the exception of some very rare cases like 2002 in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, and 1998 when the whole Monica Lewinsky thing was unfolding. So despite all the various strategies and tactics that different White Houses have taken, midterms tend to be referendums on the president and on his party. So I think that you can always, empiricism always works until it doesn't, is what people say. And you can always have some election that breaks the pattern that happens in the future. But if we're using history as a guide, and if we're trying to be principled in that way, I think that, we think that voters know Republicans are in charge, and they know what they think about President Trump and congressional Republicans and congressional Democrats, so on and so forth. And I haven't yet seen a reason in any of the data so far to suggest that 2018 is going to depart from that pattern. I mean, it could. We've got about a year until that happens, but so far it seems to be that those normal rules of politics, while some other normal rules of politics don't apply, that those rules seem to right now.
Any other thoughts? We can move to next question right here.
Number two.
Oh, someone in the back at the
right.
moment. Yes.
If Roy Moore wins in Alabama, what is the probability that the Senate would refuse to seat him?
I think they'd seat him, but they'd kick him out shortly thereafter. I think that they would. I think there's certainly a moment where this can be a defining moment and a positive for the Republican Party. We've been accused of having a war on women. It's part of why my generation doesn't want anything to do with the Republican Party. They view us as the party of the crusty old white guy and serving our corporate overlords. I think it's a moment where we can say, listen, what Roy Moore was accused of, in addition to his belief that we should criminalize homosexuality and that a Muslim shouldn't be able to serve in Congress because of their faith, that is not an American value and that's not a Republican value. So I think it could be turned into a win for the Republican Party if we got all of our members in the Senate to vote him out and expel him, because he would become the 17th person ever expelled, or 16th, pardon me. 15 others were. 14 of them were for their involvement in the Civil War. So I think that's a huge win for Republicans and a very strong message to send that we don't tolerate this type of behavior.
I don't think it would also be brilliant by Mitch McConnell and Cory Gardner, because you'd send that message on the macro level. On the micro level, you'd remove Moore. The Republican governor would probably fill that seat with someone like Jeff Sessions. And so you'd have a more cooperative member there who would have a lot better chance of winning the next election. And it puts the Democrats in a position. It takes a supermajority. It's either 60 or 66. We haven't removed a senator in a long time. Certainly not while I was there. But how many Democrats are going to vote to not expel Roy Moore? So
Well,
you got to have a confluence of interest here.
Partisan action.
It could strategically be something they could leave and hang on Republicans' necks. We elected them, we get them.
True, but if you're worried about the far left challenging you in a primary, boy, a vote to keep Moore in the Senate would be a pretty tough vote.
I believe I have a question in the middle here.
Yeah, we talked somewhat about the burnout of dealing with everything that's going on with Moore and people just throwing up their hands. But are there quantitative numbers in the polling and all about those people who are just going to go with the tribe versus people who are just not going to go and vote?
Anyone have thoughts?
I mean, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. In terms of the burnout issue, one actually kind of interesting polling number that I ran into a few months back was, I think it was YouGov and the Huffington Post polled whether people think that there's too much news and it's just so difficult to keep up and so on and so forth. A lot of Americans didn't feel that way. A lot of people are not as burnt out, are not as tuned in, are, feeling a little bit more normal about the political environment than a lot of us who do things in this sphere for a living. In terms of, turnout differences and things like that, I would, I guess, point to some of the special election results to show that in a lot of these places, Democrats are really energized. And a number of them, they're sort of turned up to 11 and want to vote in a referendum against Trump, so on and so forth. And if you look at the Virginia gubernatorial results, you see in some of the places in sort of the southwestern part of the state where Trump fared well and improved on Mitt Romney's margin, there was a little bit of a fall off in turnout. And I think, other people on the panel looked at the polls and sort of might have a similar, different assessment, but I think those are a couple useful data points.
So the idea of throwing Moore under the bus and in so doing gaining some ground with millennials, How would the Republican Party do that and then still at the same time admit that the man at the top, who has had similar behavior, is somehow exempt?
No, well, first of all, I would hope he was thrown under a school bus, because that would just be fitting. But that is a very hard and tough thing to do. To the extent of my knowledge, there have been no accusations against President Trump, and I don't mean to rationalize and excuse anything that he's been accused of, but there have been no accusations against him of somebody who is underage. 14 is not the age of consent in any of the 50 states in the Union. And if you look at what's been happening in the Republican Party before Roy Moore, and how only 1 in 5 millennials identify with the Republican ideals or conservative values, and that's at an all-time low for any generation. And then between December 2015 and March 2017, young Republicans 18 to 29, 23% left the party. They're done. They're writing us off. And we have this demographic crisis coming. So I don't think that people are going to judge the party based upon how they could do that to Roy Moore but not to Donald Trump. They're already judging the party. And this is just at least a first step where we can at least try and earn the right to be heard by them. Because we have to break through, because we're being tuned out. And it's just, party of the crusty old white guy, for lack of a better term.
Do we have another question?
Yeah, you mentioned the economy a few times, and I'm wondering what you hear from polls and the electorate about their feeling on the economy now. It used to be the most important factor. Is it still as important? And if so, how is it playing today from what you can see?
Anyone want to take a first shot at that?
Trying to think through Virginia. I think that you mentioned that not everybody is feeling as caught up in some of the politics as we in this room might be. And so I do think people are looking at their pocketbooks, and there are some good numbers there, and there are things that are going to make them happy. And when people are happier with their pocketbooks, everything tends to work out better. So I do think that still plays a factor. It will just depend on how much some of the scandal side of things makes people want to go and say, I get all that. I generally like even where you stand on the economy, but I have to do this on principle so I can tell my kids or something like that. I don't know that I can accurately predict that now, though.
I think right now the most abundant renewable energy source in the entire world is anger. And that's what's going to be fueling this election. And the economy is what's really keeping President Trump's numbers in the high 30s to mid 30s. If the economy goes, as the senator alluded to earlier, the bottom's going to fall out. And then you're going to see a real swath of anger across the country. And that's when it'll really come into play.
That's all exactly right. There's a real divergence between how people are feeling about their personal economic situation, which is finally improving with real wages at long last beginning to tick up, growing a little faster than inflation, and how they view politics. Home values have finally recovered from the housing crisis. The stock market's within 1% of its all-time high if you have 401ks. Unemployment's near the lowest it's been in a decade. As I mentioned, real wages are going up. So people look at all that and they're feeling a little bit better about their personal economics, which was mentioned normally. That's a pretty good predictor of how people vote. But they look at the politics, starting with the president, Congress's job approval rating, both parties' approval rating, and they're just disgusted. And so my guess is that this may be a rare instance in which, although people are feeling, modestly positive about their personal economic situation, it's still a change election because they look at Washington in particular and they just want to keep voting for a change until they get the kind of change they're looking for. And this change has not been it.
Are there any other questions? Here in the front.
One thing I haven't heard addressed is the importance of the women's vote, the turnout in the most recent Virginia election, and the proliferation of more women candidates. And I wonder if you think that's going to have an impact on the upcoming elections.
100%. I think that we saw it, and I think that goes back to the point I made about some of the politics. There are women who will just stand up and say, I get this, but I can't stand for some of these candidates. That speaks to still being a change election, people wanting to see something different, needing to make a point. They know that their vote counts. They know that they can make a change. I also think that, I referenced earlier some of the frustration that even people on the left had with Hillary and how that was a bit of a drag. And I think that was with some of the women's issues and things that Republicans have played into and tried to push to build support for Republicans. I think that hurt her, some of that drag on that she had depleted women's votes, and we'll see that bounce right back, and that will change some of those numbers. I also think women and right now millennials may have slightly different opinions of things like healthcare and the economy. Millennials still aren't seeing some of those economic benefits yet, and women are more interested in education and a few of those other issues, which can then lead to a differing opinion.
If you look at the Virginia exit polls and you divide by gender and by education, what you find is that Northam versus Gillespie was pretty much like Clinton versus Trump among both sets of non-college people, women and women, and among college-educated men. The place where Northam really gained was among college-educated women. So when you talk about women, you have to distinguish between different demographic types of women. I do think we've seen a lot of the anger and the resist crowd being driven by college-educated Democratic women. I think you saw that in the Democratic victories in Virginia, is that college-educated women who might have been open to a Republican appeal were not open to it in 2017. But again, you have to look at the different electorates, that in an area like a lot of these congressional districts where 18% of the people are college-educated, what you see as a women's vote won't appear because it's really a sub-slice of women. But in places like Barbara Comstock's district, that was a district that Hillary Clinton won with 52%, Northam won with 55%. If I were Barbara Comstock, I would very seriously consider taking on Tim Kaine, because she'll actually be running in a more Republican electorate.
I would add to what Henry just said. The one group of women that really turned out for Ralph Northam and did not for Hillary Clinton, African American women. They really helped Ralph Northam last week. I wrote in the New York Times in January that the Women's March was the most dangerous thing for Republicans because it was the equivalent of the Tea Party in 2010. Now, I'm not sure if that's still true because of the way the Women's March leadership has strung out and become so controversial, even among people on the left, where the New York Times is criticizing them for extremism. But I think that the organization that has gone up there, that when you have so many women who are proud to take part in this march across the country, and they're still proud. I still see the pink hats. Granted, I live in New York City, so that's clearly reflective of the national political electorate. But I think that there are a lot of people out there who are fired up, and they really feel that they want candidates who might not necessarily be women, but support women's rights, women's values, and can speak to the issues that are important to them. And they're really making their voices heard at the polls, and we saw it on last week, and we're going to see it again in 2018.
I think we have time for one more. Is there any others? Going once? Going twice? Oh, no, we have another one.
I have a second question. Bob Goodlatte is retiring. The local race that I think is interesting for everybody here. I wondered if the panel had any thoughts on why and if that seat is safe or if that's going to go over to the Democrats.
It's considered to be very safe. It was heavily for Trump, notwithstanding the Democratic portions of the district. He was termed out as a committee chairman, and typically people who have been a committee chair don't particularly want to go back to having no responsibility, so it was a completely normal and expected retirement. And if this is the sort of seat that goes Democratic, I think we're looking at a 70 or 80 seat wave, because it was overwhelmingly for Trump, notwithstanding Albemarle County.
Yeah, only one thing I'd add to that is that oftentimes you see congressmen with two motivations for leaving their seat. One is that they're in danger, and two is that it's not fun anymore. And I think that some of these...
And three is that they want to go to the Senate.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think that goes to Henry's point, is that some of these retirements in these really red districts might be just people who don't want to do the job rather than people who are in danger.
Well, with that, I think we will move on to the second panel. I want to thank our panelists. It's been great. We can give a round of applause.
Here, Bethesda.
And next up will be my colleague, Kyle Condick, who is the managing editor of Sabados Crystal Ball. He will be directing the second panel, which will be looking at Donald Trump's first year in office.